Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lunch for the Scientist. I'm Leah from Headwaters, of course, and we have with us Dr. Juliana Ruzante this week, speaking to us from San Diego. Hi, Juliana. How are you?
Hi, Leah. Doing well, and you?
I'm good. I'm so excited to hear you speak. So, Juliana has quite an impressive career. She is a research public health analyst at RTI International's Center for Health and Environmental Modeling. She's a public health veterinarian with 20 years of experience in food safety and working with foodborne diseases. And she develops strategies in food safety and antimicrobial resistance. And she fosters partnerships across many different institutes and organizations. And we are so excited to hear more. So, Juliana, I will let you take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah. Thanks so much for this kind introduction. And thanks so much for Headwaters for inviting me to be part of this amazing initiative. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope you will find this talk helpful and interesting to you. So my name is Juliana, and as Leah mentioned, I'm a public health veterinarian. I'm wondering whether you all know what a public health veterinarian is. I'm sure you are very familiar with veterinarians that take care of dogs and cats and horses. But, what is a public health veterinarian? And let me tell you a little bit about that. So we're slightly different. We work with our goal, our work is geared towards protecting the health of animals and humans. And to do our work, a lot of the times we are dealing with diseases, infectious diseases called zoonotic diseases, and those are the illnesses that can be transmitted between animals and humans. And so those are very important to be addressed, and we work on those. The kind of work I do, it's really based on this idea of One Health. And here is this picture, this nice picture that brings together and illustrate what One Health really is. And that is the combination, the union of human health, animal health, and the environmental health. This has been an approach and an area, if you will, of work where we use to address a lot of problems in public health. They're very complex, and we need to work across disciplines. I often work with physicians and epidemiologists and folks that work in environmental health, data scientists, all towards one particular goal, and that being improving public health. And you don't need to be a vet, to work in One Health. Again, it's multidisciplinary and require a lot of coordination and communication among those disciplines. And that's one of the things that I love about my job is that amount of folks from different backgrounds and different trainings, different scientists, or non-scientists really, that I interact during my day, and I think this is fascinating. But as Leah mentioned, most of my work has been around food safety, and that means I work to make sure that the food we produce is safe for us to eat. Most of the time, I'm working with pathogens that come via foods of animal origin, so meat, milk, eggs, but fresh fruits and vegetables are also subjective and can be contaminated during production. And so I end up working with fresh fruits and vegetables as well, even though I'm a vet. But again, this is how the beauty of working in the area of public health and infectious diseases. But what I want to talk to you today is about a recent area that I became very interested in, and that was through my work with animals and with food. I became very passionate and interested in the topic of antibiotic resistance. And I hope to take this time and talk to you about that very important problem that I hope we can be part of the solution as well. And I will tell a little bit about the research I have started. And again, I hope you find interesting. But before I go too far, what is an antibiotic, right? Unfortunately, maybe you're lucky you never got sick, or maybe you never need them, but those are drugs or compounds that kill other microorganisms. When we get sick with bacteria that causes disease, we can use antibiotics to help us get better, to kill the germs that are making us sick and get better. So those antibiotics, they can be produced naturally by other organisms. That's very interesting. But we can also make them in labs, and then we call them synthetic antibiotics. But microorganisms normally produce them as a way of protecting each other from other competitors and be able to survive. So as scientists, we discover those compounds produced by microorganisms, and we take advantage of them in our lives. The very interesting thing, something to really keep in mind, and it's very important for us to know, is that antibiotics do not work on viruses. So when you get a cold, that doesn't work. Antibiotic will not make you get better, okay? But we'll talk more about that and understand why this is important to know when antibiotics will work or not. The first antibiotic to be discovered was penicillin, and who found that antibiotic was Sir Alexander Fleming. It was a very interesting story about how he actually found that, because it was through his observation and his being very careful and observing his surrounding that he had this breakthrough in science, pretty much in health for us. As you can see here in this picture, I have a Petri dish, and that's I believe, a reproduction of actually the plate that Sir Alexander Fleming had. But he went on vacation. He was a microbiologist, and he went on vacation. When he came back, he was cleaning his lab, and he found this Petri dish, the one I have here in this slide, and he found this big mold growing on the plate. He shouldn't be growing there, but it happens sometimes. And he noticed that those little tiny, the smaller dots, which are colonies of bacteria, were not growing around that fungi. And he came then to find out that the juice, he called mold juice, that the mold juice was actually killing the bacteria around it. And that was the borne of penicillin, which again was a great advance and cured many folks. But unfortunately, when there is an antibiotic, there are organisms that are resistant to it. And that's just the normal fact of life. Bacteria and fungi, they can become resistant, which means the antibiotic that used to kill them no longer kills them. And they survive, and they continue growing, and they continue causing the illnesses. This is a problem for us because we can get very sick, and those infections are there, very hard to cure. Some folks also think you hear people talking about how taking antibiotics can make your body resistant, and that's not the case. What is getting resistant is actually the bacteria, and as you probably know, we have lots of bacteria in our bodies, good bacteria most of the time, right? But those bacteria can also get resistance and pass that resistance along to others. What we are creating then, and we could be creating then, as what you probably heard, those superbugs. And that's a way to say bacteria, harmful organisms that can cause a disease and not be killed by several different types of antibiotics, because we have several types of antibiotics that we work with. So those are called the superbugs, and those are really a nightmare for doctors, and we don't want to get sick with any of those, because that can be a really big headache. But how does antimicrobial or antibiotic resistance develops? It's really something that it's part of their normal evolutionary process of bacteria. It's natural selection, and it's selection of bacteria. We have, it's not something that man created. So we have a population of organisms that, for some reason, some of them have this, let's say, superpower of resisting to a certain drug, a certain antibiotic. And others don't have that superpower, let's say. And when we take the antibiotic, we then kill the bacteria that doesn't have the superpowers. And the ones that have the superpowers, which will be the resistance genes, remain. And then they remain, and they get to grow and multiply, and then they can also pass along and spread, as we call transfer and spread, that resistant gene, that superpower, to other bacteria. And then is how you have this increase in the resistance of bacteria to drugs. So this is a normal process, as I mentioned to you, and it has been happening for many, many years. However, what's going on right now is because the way we use antibiotics is leaving us, is accelerating, is speeding up the pace of this selection. So with more pressure, we get more selection, and this is happening very fast, and that becomes a problem. Here in this table, I wanted to show you what I mentioned by if there is an antibiotic, there is resistance. And this is a timeline that shows the years and when the antibiotic was deployed or was actually made commercial and people started using, and when they started seeing resistance. And you can see that it varies with the antibiotic, but between 5 to 10 years is from when you start using commercially, you start seeing resistance not too far from that. And that is a problem for example, pharmaceutical companies. Well, of course, for public health, but pharmaceutical companies and researchers, there's a lot of money that needs to be invested to develop those drugs. Is research, is testing, is approval for the drug, and is a big investment on part of the companies to do that. And companies are not really that much interested, unless there are the right incentives, to develop drugs that will soon become obsolete or not work anymore. So that is also pathogens and harmful organisms are getting resistance, and we are running out of the antibiotics. We are not discovering new antibiotics to actually fight those infections. So that's something that we need to also think about when we try to fight antibiotic resistance at the global health level, public health and global health. You might be thinking already, I'm sure you have ideas of why this topic of antibiotic resistance is important. And I have here some nice, visuals for you that tells you why we actually care about it. And one of the reasons is estimates of how bad antibiotic resistance will be 30 years from now. This is what I have here is a study from an economist in the UK that really brought a lot of attention and resulted in a lot of change, actually, in public health and how we address antimicrobial resistance. But in his study, this economist estimated that, again, 30 years from now, in 2050, the deaths associated with infections caused by organisms that are resistant to drugs will surpass the deaths attributed with cancer. And that was at the global level, if we don't do anything. So that's sort of the positive note, if we don't do anything, if we keep on our track. At the US level, CDC has also done some of their estimates, and this is the numbers that we have for the US. 2.8 million of antibiotic-resistant infections occur every year in the US, and about 35,000 people die as a result. And those are illnesses that previously used to be treatable, right? And that's what I think brings a lot of concern, is that it's not that we don't have the cure. Well, the cure no longer works, but those used to be treatable. Those are urinary tract infections that can become very complicated, pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, and cause those fatalities that, again, otherwise would have been preventative if antibiotics were working. Those types of visuals, as I mentioned to you, and this type of data that I present, and I would just go back the slide to tell you more, are very important to get the attention of the public and get the attention of policy and decision makers. As researchers, we really need to make sure that we communicate those numbers with those that are capable of making decisions and policies at the federal level or even at the global level, so we can fight such important problem in public health. So those are key information for decision makers, and very important to produce those nice looking, appealing graphs to get the attention of folks. But there are several causes of antibiotic resistance. You might be wondering, what is causing all of that and what can I do about it? Well, I will tell you a couple of things. And if you are interested, please let me know if you want more information. I'm happy to send you point you in the right direction, because this area, it can be quite complex. But the overuse is something that we hear often. The overuse of antibiotics is one of the major causes of antimicrobial resistance. And that means that using and taking antibiotics when it's not needed. So I mentioned to you that viruses are not eliminated or killed by antibiotics. So taking antibiotics when you have a cold, that it's really what would be considered a wrong way of using antibiotics. So you might be, some of the doctor's office have some posters saying that and trying to raise awareness of patients as well as doctors, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of awareness that we need to do all over the board, really. And of course, there is overuse of antibiotics in livestock, in fish farming. And if you ask me, we don't have here in this slide, but the use in small animals is also very similar to humans, right? When veterinarians can overprescribe antibiotics to infections in dogs and cats that are not necessarily needed. So we need to be very aware of how we use antibiotics so we can preserve them. Patients and dog owners and owners of animals also need to make sure that they follow the treatment. You're feeling better, you don't stop taking antibiotics. You finish the course of the treatment that the physician prescribed. So it's very important. We also need to get better, and one cause of antimicrobial resistance is because we really don't do much of a good job in preventing illnesses. If we can prevent illnesses, we don't get sick, we don't need antibiotics. So we need to do better that way. And I think I really like this figure here. And very important for us to understand how this becomes such a widespread problem. Well, of course, we are using lots of antibiotics in humans and in animals. And often physicians and veterinarians kind of have a little pointing fingers to each other, but this is really not, I don't want to discuss where, who is more responsible. I don't believe in that. I really think that this is a shared responsibility and everyone has equal parts to play. So, but you can see that we use antibiotics in animals, in people, to prevent infections, to prevent, to cure, and that use, that for many reasons, of course, we need to use, we must use, we don't want people getting sick and dying. So, but with that, again, we lead to the resistance, and this resistance circulates between animals, between humans, in environment, in water sources, in the soil. And this slide here is giving you this idea about how antimicrobial resistant, antibiotic resistant bacteria travels in our environment, in our lives, right? And you might be thinking, oh, I'm a vegetarian, or I don't really never took antibiotics in my life. Well, if you look at this picture and you pay attention, you're going to see that you might be exposed to antibiotic resistant bacteria by another contact with another person, by swimming, sometimes even just playing in the soil. So it's really beyond, and it's not as simple as, oh, I'm not going to eat any other meat, for example, right? It's more complex than that. It would be nice if it would be that simple. But to control antibiotic resistance, as I mentioned to you, it's not that simple. We need a lot of things to happen so we can be better in controlling and taking care of this very pressing public health issue. We need to be able to collect data, and that means the organisms, and monitor the resistance, the antibiotic resistance in animals, humans, and environment. And that is based on what's called surveillance, which when you're always collecting samples and looking at the results, analyzing the results, and seeing what is changing, how it's changing. And even this is also very important if you actually take a measure to prevent potentially. And you can see how things are changing positive or negatively. As I mentioned to you as well, we need to do better in preventing illnesses. And that's, again, in humans and in animals. So getting vaccine, washing your hands, being better at hygiene. And again, this is just, again, for humans and for animals. We can prevent infections. And if we prevent infections, if we don't get sick, we don't need antibiotics. So we definitely need to be better in that. We also need to make sure we only take antibiotics when we need it and when it's prescribed by a physician or a veterinarian. We also want to educate people so we are aware of how we can actually do better and help with this crisis. And as I mentioned to you before as well, we need to make sure there's the right incentives and stimuli to companies, startups, and other pharmaceuticals to actually start getting interested in producing new antibiotics and finding new compounds for us to use. But this is the area where I'm focused on. I focus on data, and I focus on how we can leverage the information or use the information that has already been collected by others to better inform decision and policies. So as I mentioned, having information, with having the right information, you can sort of paint a picture of your problem, and you can measure things better. So in my work, and this is where I'm going to talk to you about this research I'm starting, I am trying to identify existing data that has been collected by other people or other organizations, but not integrated, not pulled together to help with better painting this picture of antibiotic resistance. So I'm working with Iowa State University, and we are obtaining, collecting, getting the data that has already been produced by those veterinary diagnostic labs. Those laboratories, they receive samples from a variety of animals, from iguanas to dogs, and they test for the pathogens, and they also measure how susceptible or not they are to a number of drugs. And those results go back to the veterinarian that ordered that test and sits in the computer. So we are interested in getting all that data that is produced by those labs and looking at what does that data tell us about antibiotic resistance in animals. So we are creating a database and also a dashboard, which it's an online tool that veterinarians can go and navigate through their data and have a better idea what's going on in their community as far as antibiotic resistance. As I mentioned to you, I'm not going out and collecting the data. This data already exists. So my methodology is a little bit different from my research. However, you need to really, I get the data that was produced by other folks, but I need to be able to understand what kind of methodology they use to produce that data and what kind of population that data is coming from. I need to be able to know how and understand how the data was collected and produced, because I don't want to be making conclusions and assumptions on my data that are not realistic. I need to be very aware about the limitations and how I can use the data that I was given. So that's very important, and my training has been very valuable to be able to make and understand the limitations. For example, what we are working here is data from animals that are potentially very sick. Those are animals that actually were referred to the veterinary diagnostic lab at the university. So they have more serious infections than a regular animal at your house, or that went to a vet and that got treated and that was a problem. So we need to be aware of that. So when we get the data, we look at the data, we analyze the quality, we think about what we can do with that. Then we standardized. We need to make sure that we are calling everything by the right names. So, and with that, we then work with data scientists and programmers to design our data warehouse. We also discuss what we are trying to do, what we want folks to be able to, how they should use the data. And then we think about what kind of functions and the purpose that they want to use this data. So we come up with ideas for them to look at the data and visualize. And here's some potential graphs, not real data here, just for example, that shows, for example, you might want to look at hotspots of a certain pathogen or a certain resistance for organisms. So we developed a dashboard, we do some demonstrations, we finalize the tool, and then we publish. This work's still ongoing, but I want to, maybe one day I can come back and tell you more about it. But just some final thoughts here, because I wanted to take this opportunity to tell what I see as very important qualifications and characteristics for future scientists. And those are mainly related to, I think it's very important for us to work across very many disciplines. And the issues that we are dealing right now are quite complex, and we need to be able to work together. We also need to be better in communicating. And maybe it's a generation thing, and now young people are more used to videos and be able to communicate with using different languages. But as scientists, we need to do better to reach out to the public and to decision makers to make them understand the matters, the problems that we are working on. We also need to be better advocates for science-driven solutions. And we need to share more data in a way that is secure and ethical. People are very protective of their data with lots of reasons, but we can benefit if we can share. And we need to work together and integrate our expertise with other areas such as computer science and mathematics. And here's my little Venn diagram for data scientists, which I find fascinating. So thank you very much for your attention. This is my last slide. And once again, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana.
My pleasure.
That was really informative and really interesting. And it sounds like you work with a variety of disciplines.
Yes, that is really, I guess, I think the highlight of my job. I love just learning more about what other folks are doing and how they see the problems in a different way than I do.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So typically I get to this question at the end, but since we're talking about this kind of cross-discipline learning, I'm wondering how, if there's a young scientist out there that's interested in maybe veterinary medicine, but how they can connect it to humans or do something more, what path would you recommend a student like that take?
Well, nowadays, the vet schools, and I didn't do my vet degree here in the US, but the vet schools have a public health path. So I would recommend that if you end up going to vet school, you early on connect with your professors, the instructors that actually work with the area, because it is a big field and a great need. Here in the US, actually, there are not many of the veterinarians follow the public health career, but there is a great need for public health in veterinarians in public health. CDC also has amazing programs for veterinarians that actually graduate. But as a young scientist, there is definitely opportunities within the vet degree training.
That's great. It sounds like science is moving towards bridging disciplines, which is really great.
Yeah, I had seen so much has changed since I started working, and again, I think it's just because we are being faced with problems that one discipline cannot solve.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get into the antibiotic resistance, which you talked about so much. And so to clarify, when you're looking at antibiotic resistance, do different resistant bacteria develop in a single person, or do you see them develop in a whole spectrum of people at the same time? And when you are reporting that a drug has an antibiotic resistance against it, what's the critical number that you have to reach before reporting that?
Well, there's not necessarily a reporting of a certain resistance pattern. Surveillance targets some important, so there are some drugs, there is a range of drugs. WHO have some drugs that are more important than others, right, for treating infections in humans. So when you are collecting your data, when you're doing surveillance, and you don't necessarily, you focus on the population, right? You don't necessarily focus on individuals. So maybe going a little bit in circles here to answer your question, you basically are looking at development of resistance in general, not necessarily within an individual. right? And if it's happening in one person, it's probably happening in other persons the same way. But there are drugs or antibiotics that are more important than others. And when you see resistance increasing in a drug that you're really concerned, like ciprofloxacin, azithromycin, you get more concern than when you see, for example, resistance increasing in tetracycline. And that's just throwing up some names there, but just to give an idea that not all antibiotics are sort of created equal. Does that maybe answer your question? But public health, the government, CDC, have they sample, they monitor infectious illnesses to see what's going on in the population and what's going up or going down. But that's not.
Interesting. So to follow up on that, we've got an audience question here. Lara wants to know if the increase in population has also made it possible for bacteria to have more mutations.
Yeah, so I am not aware of any studies that actually linked increased in population with increased in bacteria in resistance, but its opportunity, what is leading to antimicrobial resistance is, again, the fact that we are using more antibiotics. If you want to think about in animal production, for example, and that's not the case for every single animal production, but in animal production, when you try to increase the number of animals in a single space, so I'm talking about now animal population and animal production, but when you have a lot of animals in one location, which is needed for us to produce all the protein, animal protein that we want at a certain cost, we then make animals more subjected to diseases. And then that's how a lot of the antibiotics are used. They are used to try to minimize the chances of spreading illnesses in situations where you have a lot of animals or fish together in a space. But this idea of using antibiotics to preventing illnesses in animals has been discussed in great extent by the FDA, and there are some voluntary measures in place to try to reduce that use and focus on better hygiene, as I mentioned, within animal production. And that the same goes for a population. I think better hygienes and reducing the chances for spread of illnesses reduces the chances of the use of antibiotics, that then reduce the changes slows down the mutations. Does it make sense, Lara?
Connected. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So I wondered if you could give an example. You talked about those superbugs. Is there a prominent example from recent history of a superbug that scientists discovered?
Well, there is, I think the superbugs, as far as what I am aware, they are sort of a new thing, so to speak, right? They have found DNA that has been frozen for 30,000 years, and those DNAs had resistance genes. Those organisms, had, it was proven that, back in, 30,000 years ago, there were genes of resistance. Whether those were superbugs per se, I'm not sure whether they were, but the superbugs pretty much are a result of our modern use of drugs, and how when an organism carries a lot of resistant genes, it also comes to a cost to the organism. It's a very interesting thing. So those superbugs might have some loss of other functions because there's so much super that can be. right? So there is research saying about this efficiency and cost, the cost of actually being a superbug, because your DNA, your machinery needs to carry all those genes. And so we will see whether they're going to keep having an advantage and being able to survive in the environment as well as others. But it's superbugs. I don't necessarily like that name, but that's often how people refer to, them. But and it's sketchy, right? For sure.
Right.
But it's a result of how we use it and those interactions in the environment. We need to be aware that every time we take an antibiotic, or we give an antibiotic to an animal, a large portion of the antibiotic is eliminated in our urine or in our feces in active form. So when the waste from animals, from humans that are taking antibiotics reach waste treatment plants, you have a lot of active, functioning, perfectly active antibiotic in that waste. And in that waste, you also have tons and tons of bacteria, correct? So the resistance is also happening outside our bodies, right? Not just within ourselves. It's happening out of us. So as I mentioned to you, you might be someone that I never took antibiotics. I am vegetarian, for example. I don't eat meat from animals, but you can still be exposed to potentially a resistant organism just through soil and water, and I'm not going to say air, but maybe we're going to get there at some point. Dust, I guess.
Right. And are scientists concerned that as people have kind of these more passive ways of receiving all of this resistant bacteria, and you said there's less development of new antibiotics, are scientists concerned about the future?
Oh, very much. Yeah, no, I think there is a lot of concern, I think, globally. And that's the other interesting thing about antibiotic resistance, is that there is a consensus that this is not necessarily, this is a US thing or a Europe thing or a Brazil thing. This is a global problem. And for example, for instances, the funding that is being poured into those problems are being is to address the issues globally, because it doesn't matter for, let's say, for instance, United States to really get this under control, but you have travels, you have imports, you have a world around you that also needs to be on the same page. So in order to fight antibiotic resistance, you need to have a global approach. And there is a lot of concern about how antibiotics are being used in other countries as well, maybe where hygienes and waterborne diseases, access to clean water and clean food are not as similar as here in other countries, where you have those diseases that could be easily prevented, but then folks are getting sick from drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated food, and then they need more antibiotics, and it kind of so it's a huge public health concern. World Health Organization has put out many efforts, CDC as well. It's again a global. They call a public health crisis. So, and it reached that level of concern with several of the studies that, especially with the study that I mentioned, comparing. I think was a wake-up call when they compared the deaths of antibiotic resistance with the deaths of cancer, and showing that without doing anything, we will surpass deaths, global deaths, the number of global deaths associated with cancer. So I think folks are very concerned about that.
Yeah,
No doubt.
we have so many more questions for you, but maybe if we can kind of wrap up on a positive note, I
Sure.
wonder, you talked about preventing illness and preventing the spread of illness. Are there other kind of positives that where people can take action in their own lives to make tiny steps towards helping this crisis?
Yeah, well, so I guess this is COVID times, and washing your hands, it's again, it's amazing what you can achieve when you wash your hands and you follow good hygiene practices. This is, you can really do so much for yourself. And antibiotics are not, I don't want to meet, it's a good thing. It's a good thing we have them. And if you need to take them, take them. It's not something you should not use. We just need to be aware. But we are doing a lot of progress. I have to say that again, we're educating folks and we are moving in the right direction.
That's great.
Yeah, but definitely wash your hands. I think again, this is key here for when you think about what you can do. And if you need to take antibiotics, make sure you take it exactly as prescribed.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Juliana Ruzante, thank you so much for everything you've shared today. You've given us a lot of insight into your research.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity again, and all the best. This is wonderful, and I think it goes to my point on communicating this initiative from Headwaters. It's wonderful that you guys are reaching out to young audience and having scientists that sometimes can be uncomfortable talking about their research. I'm guilty of that as well, and trying to facilitate and make people easier to understand the research you do. This is fantastic. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Great. Yes, as Juliana said, if you are just kind of new to this series, Lunch with a Scientist was designed to show young people possibilities and careers in the sciences, and to kind of highlight some science careers that might be more behind the scenes that we don't know about. And if you're watching and you know a scientist or you are one and you would be interested in presenting your research, please get in touch. We would love to have you. And otherwise, I just want to thank you, Juliana, and I think we'll sign off.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks all, everyone.